At the anniversary party, I saw my husband, Trevor, standing in a dark corner, his hand running down the back of Brooke, his ex-girlfriend. I walked up calmly and said, "Oh, honey, do you two need a room?" But instead of seeing a guilty look on his face, he looked me straight in the eyes and said, "If you can't handle this, or me spending the weekend with my ex, go to hell." I didn't scream. Has anyone else ever been told they were overreacting when their gut was screaming the truth? Drop a comment with where you're listening from. I want to know who has survived this kind of gaslighting. I didn't run out of that ballroom. Running implies panic, and I was far beyond that. I walked through the opulent lobby of the Intercontinental, past the polished brass and the heavy scent of expensive lilies, and stepped into the damp Boston night. Behind me, the anniversary celebration continued for a marriage that had just been declared dead in the dark corner of a banquet room. I didn't feel the sting of tears. I felt the cold, hard logic of a woman who had finally seen the bottom of a bad investment. I walked until I reached the edge of the harbor. The water was black and restless, matching the thoughts clicking into place in my head like the tumblers of a safe. I sat on a stone ledge, the wind whipping my hair across my face, and pulled out my laptop. I didn't look at photos of our 8 years together. I didn't scroll through messages hoping for an apology that would never carry any actual value. Instead, I went straight to my archived emails. There it was, the offer from the international firm in Singapore. 2 years ago, they had reached out with a position for a strategic director. While the initial role had been filled, their recent expansion into the Southeast Asian market created a new opening, and the headhunter reached out again, stating I remained their gold standard for the position, a salary of $280,000. At the time, Trevor had laughed it off. He said, "My place was here, supporting the architectural firm he was building and anchoring the home he needed." I had believed him. I had treated my own career like a secondary asset, something to be liquidated whenever his ego needed a boost. I had been the silent investor in his vision, and tonight I realized the fund was completely empty. I saw the follow-up email from 4 days ago. They were still looking. They still wanted me. In the world of high-stakes corporate headhunting, timing is everything. Their primary candidate had just fallen through, and they needed a lead who could hit the ground running without a learning curve. I had already quietly completed the preliminary background checks and updated my professional visa documents months ago, keeping the door ajar just in case I finally needed to walk through it. I didn't call Trevor to argue. I didn't text my friend Kayla yet. I simply opened the attachment. My fingers were steady as I typed my name into the digital signature block. $280,000, a relocation package, and a fresh start halfway across the world. By the time the clock hit midnight, I had moved my entire life's trajectory. This wasn't a sudden whim of a heartbroken wife. It was a tactical withdrawal of my presence. I started thinking in terms of numbers. 8 years. Roughly 2,920 days of putting his deadlines before my own. Thousands of hours spent editing his proposals and managing his social landscape while my own ambitions gathered dust in the basement. I had subsidized his rise with my silence, and he had used that profit to buy luxury gifts for Brooke. It was a classic case of embezzlement, not just of money, but of my time and my soul. The laptop screen glowed in the dark, a small beacon of digital retribution. Trevor thought he had sent me to hell with his ultimatum, but he had actually sent me to the departure's gate. I sat there for another hour, watching the ships in the harbor, calculating the logistics of my exit with clinical precision. I wasn't going to beg for respect in a house where I was treated like a placeholder. I was going to become the architect of my own existence. The contract was signed, the assets were shifting, and Trevor was still in that ballroom, celebrating a life that was about to vanish from under him. For nearly a decade, I had been the silent architect of Trevor's success. I looked at my hands in the dim light of the harbor, realizing they were stained with the invisible labor of a marriage that never intended to yield a return on investment. This wasn't just a betrayal of the heart, it was a breach of contract. 8 years ago, I was on a fast track to becoming a senior vice president at one of the top marketing firms in the country. But then, Trevor's architectural firm hit a rough patch. He needed me. He needed my steady income to pay the office rent, and he needed my networking skills to land the clients that eventually made him famous. I told myself it was love. I told myself that a partnership meant one person carries the weight until the other can walk. But looking back now, with the cold clarity of a balance sheet, I see that my compassion had been a luxury he'd overdrafted for years. I had become a placeholder in my own life. I spent my days making sure his world was seamless, while mine remained a series of fragmented dreams. Why did I stay? It's the question everyone asks when they see the wreckage from the outside. But what they don't understand are the invisible chains of a survivor. For years, I had been living in a psychological cage with the door wide open. It's a mechanism of survival called learned helplessness. When you spend enough time trying to fix a broken system, your brain starts to believe that the effort itself is the destination. You stop looking for the exit because you're too busy trying to reinforce the walls. I thought if I gave him enough space, and if I provided enough support, he would eventually see me. I was waiting for a dividend that was never meant to be paid. I was the person who stayed at the table long after the meal was over, paying the bill for a party I wasn't even enjoying. Every time he missed a dinner, or every time his meetings ran late into the night, I added another brick to the wall of my own denial. I was invested in the illusion. I wasn't a wife to him. I was a subscription service he'd forgotten he was paying for, except I was the one footing the bill. My career, my location, and my very identity had been liquidated to fund his rise. And the moment he achieved it, he used that newfound power to tell me to go to hell. It was a simple accounting error on my part. I had overvalued him and undervalued myself. But tonight, the audit is complete. I am no longer interested in fixing a structure with a rotten foundation. I am pulling my capital. All of it. The 8 years of sacrifice are a sunken cost. I'm moving my assets to a market that actually knows how to value them. Singapore isn't just a job, it's the reclamation of the woman I was before I decided to become Trevor's safety net. He wants his ex, he can have her. But he won't have the woman who built the stage he's standing on. Trevor didn't crawl into the house until 1 a.m, the heavy scent of top-shelf whiskey and Brooke's signature floral perfume clinging to him like a second skin. I was sitting in the kitchen, the lights dimmed, and my laptop closed. He tossed his keys onto the marble island, the metal clattering against the stone with a sharpness that matched the irritation in his eyes. He didn't ask where I had gone or if I was okay. Instead, he launched into the same defensive script he'd been rehearsing for months. He told me I was overreacting again, that he and Brooke were just friends, and that my lack of trust was the real poison in our marriage. I watched him speak, and for the first time, I felt absolutely nothing. No urge to defend my intuition, no desire to provide a list of boundaries he'd already trampled. I simply nodded and told him he was right. I told him I had been stressed with work and that I was sorry for the scene at the party. I watched the tension leave his shoulders, not because he felt guilty, but because his source of stability had just validated his lies. He patted my hand with a patronizing half smile, assuming the machine was back in working order. But the woman he was touching was already halfway to Singapore. I waited for him to fall into a deep, alcohol-induced sleep before I left the house to meet Kayla. She had been my friend since our freshman year, and now she was one of the sharpest corporate attorneys in Boston. We met at an all-night diner, the kind of place where the coffee is bitter and the light is unforgiving. I didn't come to her for a shoulder to cry on, I came for a digital autopsy. We opened the family tracking app I'd installed on Trevor's phone 2 years ago, when he claimed he was worried about my safety during late commutes. He'd forgotten it was even there. For the next 3 hours, we performed a methodical audit of his life. We cross-referenced his movement logs with Brooke's public Instagram posts. The evidence was staggering. Every Saturday night for the past 6 months, when he told me he was in late-night project meetings or networking with developers, his phone's location ping was stationary. The little blue dot on the map didn't move from a high-end neighborhood in the Back Bay exactly 3 blocks from Brooke's townhouse. Then, Kayla pulled up Brooke's social media. While Trevor was texting me about heavy traffic and cold pizza, Brooke was posting photos of vintage wines and candlelit dinners at windowside tables I recognized from the harbor. The timestamps were identical. The lighting was the same. The intersection of their lives formed a perfect grid of betrayal. Kayla didn't offer platitudes. She dropped her voice into the clinical tone she used for high-stakes litigation and told me that silence only holds real power when it's backed by fact. She helped me build a chronological file, naming each folder by date and location, stripping away the emotion until all that was left were the raw numbers. We found hotel charges from a resort in Michigan during a weekend. He said he was at an architecture seminar. We found jewelry store transactions for items I'd never seen. I stared at the glowing screen, my heart beating with the steady rhythm of a calculator. This wasn't a marriage anymore. It was a forensic investigation. Trevor believed he was playing a high-stakes game of chess, but he didn't realize I'd already cleared the board. I wasn't the grieving wife, I was the auditor, and the bill was finally coming due. The coffee had gone cold, but the data on the screen was burning white hot. Kayla's eyes narrowed as she highlighted a series of transfers from our joint home equity line of credit. This wasn't the petty spending of a man buying expensive dinners to impress a mistress. This was a systematic extraction, $45,000. That was the amount Trevor had siphoned from the heart of our shared life over the last 90 days. He hadn't just moved the money. He had forged my digital signature to authorize the equity line expansion, crossing the line into identity theft and bank fraud. It wasn't an accidental oversight or a series of bad investments. It was a calculated liquidation of our joint assets. The recipient wasn't a shell company or a hidden account, it was Brooke's boutique real estate firm. Trevor had been telling me that he was working overtime to secure our future, but the ledger told a different story. He was siphoning the equity I had worked 60-hour weeks to build, and he was using it to stage Brooke's failing luxury listings. He was literally using my hard-earned capital to decorate the stage of his own betrayal. He wasn't just an unfaithful husband, he was a financial predator. But then, Kayla found the kill shot, the detail that turned a family drama into a criminal enterprise. She pulled up a public record from the state licensing board. Brooke wasn't just a struggling realtor. She was the primary defendant in a massive professional liability lawsuit. She had been accused of fraudulent misrepresentation and inflating property values to secure predatory loans. The legal fees were mounting, and her firm's insurance had already hit its limit. Brooke was being sued for nearly $2 million, and she was desperate. Trevor wasn't just a lover to her, he was an unsecured line of credit. He was funneling $45,000 of our money into a legal defense fund for a woman who was facing professional debarment. I looked at the timestamps of the transfers. They happened on the same days he would text me saying he was feeling the pressure and needed me to pick up the slack on our household bills. I had been subsidizing a criminal defense for the woman he was sleeping with. Every time I had cooked him dinner or told him to take a nap because he looked tired, I had been an unwitting accomplice in my own robbery. I didn't feel the sting of tears this time. Anger wasn't loud, it was clinical. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon a memory of love, but there was only the cold logic of a balance sheet. This wasn't a marriage that had drifted apart. It was a business that had been hollowed out by an embezzler. Kayla sat back, the blue light of the laptop reflecting in her glasses like a digital verdict. She told me that this level of siphoning crossed the line from a civil dispute to criminal fraud. She asked me if I wanted to wait for an explanation. I told her no. You don't negotiate with someone who is currently picking your pockets. I thought about the house in Boston, the one with the harbor view that I had curated with so much care. To Trevor, it was just collateral for Brooke's legal bills. To me, it was a crime scene. I was no longer interested in the why. I only cared about the how much. I had been the silent investor in Trevor's life, but tonight I was filing for a complete and total withdrawal. The architecture of my life was changing, and for the first time, the foundation was made of facts, not faith. The hours blurred into a high-speed execution of a pre-planned exit strategy. I moved with the relentless efficiency of a machine that had been waiting for the green light for years, fueled by a cold, quiet adrenaline. I didn't wait for him to wake up. I didn't need the performance of a final goodbye. I walked into the bedroom and pulled my suitcase from the corner of the closet, the one I had used only for short trips with him over the years, never imagining I'd one day open it to leave alone. I unzipped it slowly, not out of hesitation, but because I wanted to be certain that every single item I put inside belonged only to me. No confusion, no shared history, no ambiguity. I started with the foundations. My birth certificate, my marriage license, the contract I was about to terminate, my diplomas, the personal records I had stored safely in the bottom drawer. Then, my passport untouched for years because I had always prioritized Trevor's schedule over my own opportunities. I took the printed copy of my new job contract, neatly clipped in a slim folder, Strategic Director, $280,000. My personal laptop, the one I used every night to prepare the work that actually paid our bills. I didn't take anything Trevor had bought for me, not the designer handbags, and not the jewelry. Not because they lacked material value, but because I didn't want to carry anything tied to the silence I once exchanged, to preserve a marriage that was rotting from the inside out. As the suitcase gradually filled, I realized it wasn't as heavy as I had imagined. What I was carrying wasn't 8 years of memories, but only what I truly needed to begin again. Before leaving, I took one slow lap around the house. I wasn't reminiscing. I was performing a final walkthrough to ensure no part of myself was left behind. I stopped at the vanity where the old wedding ring box had sat untouched for 8 years. I opened the lid, placed the house key inside, and closed it gently. It was the last thing I would ever do to keep our life looking intact from the outside. I left no note, no warning. Boundaries don't need to be written in long paragraphs. They only need to be set clearly and never moved again. The plane touched down at Changi Airport after a long 19-hour haul. I wheeled my suitcase out through the arrivals gate, exhausted in the way only transoceanic travel brings. But mentally, I felt more alert than ever. The moment I reconnected my phone, the screen lit up like a distress signal. A flood of messages from Trevor. They no longer carried the usual confidence or superiority. They carried the raw panic of a man who just realized that his safety net had vanished. I stood still among the stream of people at the airport, listening to the boarding announcements. I finally opened the one message that made my heart feel like stone. Trevor wrote, "What's your weekend like? I need you to sign some disbursement papers for the equity line." He was still at Brooke's house, yet he wanted me to handle the logistics of his lifestyle. I stared at that message for a long time. For the first time, I didn't feel defeated. I only felt a sharp clarity that every word from him from this moment on had lost its weight. I rolled my suitcase outside and stood in front of Marina Bay Sands, glowing bright in the Singapore night. The lights reflected off the glass like a solid wall, separating me from my old life. I lifted my phone and took a selfie. An unposed, expressionless photo of a woman who had just walked out of an 8-year illusion. I sent it as a time-stamped, geolocated confirmation of my new residency. A cold, digital boundary marking the official start of our legal separation. I sent the picture without a single word attached. 4 seconds later, my phone buzzed. Trevor's reply was typed entirely in uppercase. "Are you really in Singapore?" As if only now he began to understand that my silence wasn't a temporary tantrum. I didn't reply. Standing before that skyline, I knew very clearly that this selfie wasn't sent to hurt him. It was sent to end, once and for all, Trevor's final illusion that I would always be there, waiting for him. Kayla didn't file for divorce right away. She knew that some truths need to be placed in the right setting before being brought to light. That setting wasn't a shouting match, it was the boardroom. She sent the complete evidence file to Catherine, the CEO of Trevor's architecture firm. It was a sequence of logical, undeniable facts matching timestamps, expense receipts for those $45,000, and the siphoned equity logs. More importantly, the files proved Trevor had used the firm's proprietary software and client leads to assist Brooke's boutique firm, a gross violation of his non-compete and ethics agreement. Catherine, a woman who valued ethical leadership above all else, didn't hesitate. The evidence of the data breach and his unauthorized use of company servers to benefit a competitor triggered an immediate security protocol, allowing for his instant suspension pending a full forensic audit. Trevor was summoned to a closed-door meeting and terminated that very afternoon. His office access was deactivated, and his reputation, which I had spent 8 years helping him build, collapsed in less than an hour. On another front, Brooke's downfall was just as swift. The $45,000 Trevor siphoned wasn't enough to stop the momentum of her existing fraud lawsuit. While a full revocation usually takes months of hearings, the severity of the bank fraud evidence we provided triggered an immediate emergency suspension of Brooke's license, freezing her ability to operate by sunrise. When the truth of the embezzlement came to light, her professional license was revoked. In less than 2 months, the woman who lived for luxury and status was filing for bankruptcy. When the glow of the spotlights faded, Trevor and Brooke didn't have love to fall back on. They had only the rubble of their own making. They began blaming each other instinctively, Trevor screaming that she ruined his career, and Brooke calling him an unsecured line of credit that had finally run dry. I took no part in their destruction. I was too busy living. This is what I call the justice of the sower. Most people focus on the fire of revenge, the desperate desire to see the other person burn. But the ultimate victory is moving from the justice of punishment, which is anchored in the past, to the justice of the sower, which is focused on building the future. My true revenge wasn't Trevor losing his job, it was me gaining mine. It was a $280,000 salary, the high-rise in Singapore, and the peace of a life where I am no longer a silent investor in someone else's lies. Looking back, I realized that sensibility was just the cage I built for myself. I spent a decade being the bigger person, only to discover that it was just a polite way of being compliant. I've come to realize that sometimes the most compassionate thing you can do is walk away. If you find yourself in a similar situation, being treated like a placeholder in your own life, remember this. Your worth is not a negotiation. You do not need their permission to be luminous. This is my letter to those who have always felt like they were living at the edge of their own happiness. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes, it's the only way to set yourself free from the expectation that they will ever change. Stop waiting for them to choose you. Choose yourself, and the rest of the world will have no choice but to follow your lead. Grace stopped being sensible and started being free. If my journey made you feel a little less alone or gave you the courage to draw your own lines, then this story has meant something. Please hit like, share this with one person who needs to hear they are enough, and subscribe so you don't miss the next stories of the women who stopped waiting and started walking forward on their own 2 feet. Thank you for listening.